Talk about the week's business news. Joining us on the line, as always, Bernard Hickey. Afternoon, Bernard.
Hello.
Quite a bit of data this week. Of course, we had the current account deficit on Thursday and the GDP number out on Friday. Probably the most concerning aspect of that was the trade numbers.
Yes, it's clear that New Zealand is still not paying its way in the world, that its current account deficit is running at 8.9% of GDP. That means that for every $10 we earn, we're spending almost $11. That's just not sustainable for New Zealand, which already has a very high foreign debt, and it's something that the credit rating agency, Standard & Poor's, is watching closely as it considers whether or not to downgrade our sovereign credit rating. And it's something, too, that the government is watching. It's interesting, Bill English has been talking a lot in the last week or so about twin deficits. What he's talking about there is we have a current account deficit, which is our external deficit, and which essentially reflects the fact that consumers have been borrowing more than they needed or should have, and we now have a government deficit. And when you've got twin deficits of this sort of size, that's a problem for the ratings agencies and one that they'll focus on. So another sign that New Zealand really needs to continue to restrict its spending, to save more, and to try and pay its way in the world.
Yeah, I guess we could think about it like two separate overdrafts, Bernard. We've got our foreign overdraft, which is getting higher and higher up on its limits, and we've got our domestic overdraft as well, and that's not looking good either. And I guess that was part of the reason why we saw the government this week begin to talk about cutting out communication staff, for instance, in Wellington.
That's right, and a good thing too. There's just too many PR people in Wellington, over 320 according to the government, which is about 4 times more than the number of journalists they're having to send their press releases to. The big story here is that essentially New Zealand is in the hands of its bankers. When Bill English considers what type of budget he's going to write, he now has a quiet chat to the guys at Standard & Poor's and at some of the big investors in New Zealand and says, well, what sort of budget should we be writing? Because we really are in their hands. If we put out a budget on May 28th, which involves heavy new spending and a fiscal stimulus package to try and boost the economy, which was significantly bigger than the one that's already there, then we would see a downgrade in our credit rating. And when that happens, interest rates rise. And that effectively blows away any of the benefits of a fiscal stimulus. And so the government, I think, is right to be very careful about spending, to put this cap on public sector, our core public sector numbers, and to cut back on unnecessary spending wherever they can. Because if we don't do it, the rest of the world will make us do it.
Yeah, we spoke to John Key on the program last week, and he certainly alluded to the fact that we shouldn't be expecting much from this budget. We also had the IMF in the country this week too, Bernard, and they really raised the same sort of issues that we've heard from the ratings agencies as well.
Yes, they would also like to see the Reserve Bank cut the official cash rate a bit more, although, again, we're restricted by our high foreign debts and the need to attract foreign investors to invest in New Zealand. And one of the ways to do that is to keep your interest rates high. Now, 3%, which is what the official cash rate is now, doesn't seem very high, but it's a heck of a lot higher than 0.25% or 0.5% that we see in the United States and the UK, for example. So the Reserve Bank has the same restrictions, really, that the government has. And all of this is really coming home to roost for New Zealand, the fact that we have such high overseas debts. We're seeing interest rates rise, and that's starting to filter through now into mortgage rates for mums and dads, as we've seen this week a big increase in the long-term mortgage rates from around about 6% to, in some cases, over 7% for 5 and 4 year mortgage rates.
Yeah, so the banks are clearly starting to move.
That's right. Essentially, New Zealand doesn't save enough. And when New Zealanders decided in the last couple of weeks that they needed to fix their mortgage rates, they all rushed onto the market, the wholesale markets, and said, okay, the banks, who are our proxies here, jumped onto the wholesale markets and said, all our customers want to fix it 5 years. Who's going to lend us the money? And there wasn't anyone there. That's the problem. And so, of course, the interest rate had to go up to get that money in, partly because in the wholesale markets there has been some winnowing out of suppliers there. So some of the big foreign banks who are involved in Sydney and lending into the New Zealand market, they've gone, pulled back. And also simply New Zealanders don't save enough. So that has meant interest rates have risen. That's the end result of New Zealand not saving enough over the years.
While we're not saving enough, we're perhaps starting to get the message about slowing down our spending, and that came through in the import data we saw this week as well too. Yes,
this was very interesting. A good sign, actually, that came out on the same day as the GDP figures. The GDP contraction was 0.9% in line with expectations, but it was the trade surplus for February that looks to have really been a good sign. Exports were down 6%, but imports were down even more by 14%, largely because of the reduction in the oil price, which we can't take any credit for, but also a reduction in imports, particularly cars and other non-essential consumer goods, which shows that New Zealanders are slowly getting the message they need to spend less and save more.
Bernard, interestingly, this issue raised internationally, and we've begun to see some standoff going on, certainly between China and the United States, but this whole issue about the future of the global reserve currency, what did you make of all of that?
Oh, this is a fascinating story, and really the biggest one to hit the financial world this week. A few days ago, the head of the Central Bank of China came out in a rather obscure academic paper and said we should have a different global reserve currency. Obviously, right now, it's the US dollar. But what the Chinese say is very important here, because the Chinese have about $1 trillion invested in US Treasury bonds, and America needs China to keep buying those bonds. And when China says, we're worried that you're printing too much money, that you're borrowing too much money, that you're devaluing those assets we have in the United States, that is a worry for the US and potentially destabilizing for the global financial system. So this caused quite a stir in financial markets when the Chinese central bank governor said this. And then, unfortunately for the US dollar, when US Treasury Secretary Geithner was asked about this in Congress, he said, at least initially, that that's not a bad idea, that we perhaps should have a different global reserve currency. Now, this was crazy talk from a US Treasury Secretary. The first thing he should say whenever he's asked about the US dollar is it's a strong currency and we stand behind it 100%. He eventually did come out after being passed a few notes from people after the currency fell immediately on his comments. He said, yes, well, the US dollar is relatively strong and will remain the reserve currency. But this will be a key issue when the world's leaders, the G7 leaders, meet on April the 2nd. Will the US dollar remain the world's reserve currency? And if it doesn't, if we see some sort of move to a basket of currencies, which is what China wants, then that will have a significant impact on how we finance investment globally and how the trade system works. Because at the moment, the US dollar is at the heart of everything.
And that will perhaps be the ultimate indignity for the US to lose that reserve currency status, because obviously it's something that's very important to them.
Yes, that's right. It tells you we've seen a shift in the tectonic plates of the global financial system and of power, effectively, in the world. Now, I actually don't think we're going to see that change in the reserve currency anytime soon, but just the mere fact that it's being talked about is a sign of weakness of the United States position, and it's because Barack Obama has chosen to go down this path of trying to borrow and spend and print his way out of trouble, a trouble that was created by too much borrowing and spending. And many of the world's investors think it simply won't work.